So I'm going to be talking about the history of Japanese Christianity in a rather quick survey style, but I also want to interweave our own personal experience. So I'll begin with a story. In 1988, my wife Carol and I were appointed as Presbyterian mission co-workers, and I was teaching at Hokuriku Gakuin, which is on the Japan seaside in Kanazawa, a small port city, well, not exactly a port city, but near a port city on the Japan Sea. And during my interview with two local Japanese pastors who were on the board at Hokuriku Gakuin, one of them, Osumi Keizo, said to me, "Welcome to Rome in AD 150. And I scratched my head and I thought, what is this guy talking about? Welcome to Rome in AD 150. Admittedly, it took me many years to unpack that very dense and very wise expression, but it took me a while. But I'll never forget his words, and I'm very grateful for them. And with that statement, welcome to Rome in AD 150, I want to begin this introduction. So soon after being appointed at Hokuriku Gakuin, one of my students came to me and said, "Hastings Sensei, I want to be baptized." And I said, "Great, wonderful, that's good news." And so I said, "You should speak with your local church pastor and your family, because I don't believe that people like me who are mission co-workers have the authority to baptize people in Japan, except in rare cases when there isn't a Japanese pastor available." So that's my perspective. And so she said, "Okay, I'll do that." And she went home and talked to her parents, and literally the next day, her mother came knocking on the door of my kenkyushitsu, my office at Hokuriku Gakuin, and she was very, very upset. And she said, "Musume wa yaso ni naru to oyome ni naren." Now that's Noto dialect, which means, if my daughter becomes a Christian, she cannot get married. She can never be a bride. Now, admittedly, they were from Noto Hanto, which is a very rural fishing district in Japan. And, but this story really illustrates the not uncommon perception that Christianity is a foreign intruder that threatens to disrupt Japan's long-established social order. So we Americans love statistics, so let's begin with a few statistics. According to the third edition of the World Christian Encyclopedia, of the 2.6 million people who identify as Christians, they self-identify as Christians in Japan, 570,000 are Protestant, 535,000 are Roman Catholic, 32,000 are Orthodox, and roughly 1.1 million are independent. And my Japanese friends may be surprised to see that, but that's a category that includes Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, etc., as well as some Japanese indigenous groups. So in spite of its status as a predominantly urban and middle-class minority faith, this is an important point. Christianity's influence on Japan's society has not been insignificant. It's been rather significant in terms of human rights, minority rights, women's rights, anti-war, various fields. Education is a huge one. So it's a kind of a complex situation. The people who are actually baptized and become communicant members of a church is a tiny minority. But the influence, you might say the echo, the resonance of Christian faith into Japanese society has not been insignificant. Later on, I'll touch on a comment that Mako makes in that book that he mentioned. But so that gives you a sense of how a tiny minority is having a significant influence. However, it's not an easy situation. And one of the ways to understand this, there are many ways to look at this, but you look at what I call the religious ecology of Japan. Okay, the religious ecology of Japan, basically the division of labor, if you will, of religion in Japan, Shinto as the religion of the land and the nation. Local identity is sustained by cyclical events at local shrines, the emperor system, and Yasukuni Shrine. That's the Shinto aspect of Japanese identity. Then there's number 2, Buddhism as a religion of the family or the household, Ye. Familial and transgenerational, and I would say universal identity is sustained by regular remembrance of ancestors at the family altar in the home and seasonal rituals at the family grave. This is very important in Japan. And virtually everybody participates in these, okay? And then number 3, Christianity as a religion of individual choice. Now, this is my view. This is how I have characterized Christianity, and you'll come to understand why I came to that conclusion after living and working and teaching in Japan for 23 years. Okay, this religious identity of Japanese Christians is sustained by interaction with like-minded individuals in the church, like All Saints, usually very small congregations, by the way, and a strong identification with the West. Those are the 2 points I want to emphasize. Okay, now let's go on to some Japanese voices. Let's listen to how some Japanese voices, Japanese Christian leaders, have talked about this problem. And one of them is Kagawa Toyohiko, who was a famous evangelist and social reformer. And this is what he said about Japanese churches' captivity to an imported abstract theology that does not necessarily touch the heart and mind of the Japanese people. Okay? So this is what he said. Kagawa did not mince words. He was very direct in his speech. So this is in 1933 in a book that he wrote. Christianity, introduced from the West because of its individualism, fails to understand the group life of the Japanese. This failure has greatly retarded Christian progress in this land. And then he tells a story. The parents of an eminent actress were murdered by burglars. A Christian pastor called after hearing about this tragedy. He entered very formally by the front entrance, the Genkan, and endeavored to comfort her with the tenets of his faith. He read the Bible, he prayed with her. However, a Shinto believer also called. She entered the back door of the house, cleaned up the kitchen, and brought order out of the chaos caused by this incident. So the outcome was that this actress espoused the Shinto faith. Her reasoning is interesting. She declared, "Christian teaching is sublime, but too difficult for me to grasp. The Shinto believer was kind, not overly dignified, and friendly, so I accepted her faith. The Protestantism introduced into Japan from Europe was strongly intellectualized and overemphasized its theology. This left a gap between Christianity and the uneducated masses. There is a danger, therefore, of it becoming merely the religion of the intelligentsia, a minority group." That's in 1933. Kagawa's fear that this would happen was prescient. Let's be honest. Because in spite of massive foreign and Japanese efforts, today Christians in Japan are only 1% of the total population, and still highly concentrated in the same port cities where the missionaries originally came. So also Furuya Yasuo, who was one of my mentors, he taught at ICU, and he points out that Japanese Christianity has developed with little interaction with Shinto and Buddhism. And that is, those are the religions of the masses. So Japanese Christianity has been on its separate track, if you will. And so that's what we have to conclude. This is not meant as a criticism of a Western missionary, because I was actually encouraging my Japanese students to become more Japanese. And I'll go into that a little bit more later. But I'm not trying to defend my own position. It's a difficult position, being between two societies, two churches, two cultures. It's liminal space, to say the least. But Japanese Christianity is still a Western-leaning, individualistic, urban, middle-class phenomenon that has not fared well with the masses of the Japanese people. Now, there are exceptions. I think Tom is probably fourth or fifth generation, maybe sixth generation Japanese Christian. So there are exceptions. Okay. While struggling to negotiate the difficult questions of how Christians can approach the traditional community and society of Japan, Christians have continued, especially theologians, have continued to identify with the West. I can't go into that, but Japanese theology is still a question mark. Is there such a thing as Japanese theology, or is it mainly translation? This is not my view. This is the view of Japanese self-critical theologians. Is there such a thing as Japanese theology? If there is, what is it? There are some examples of indigenous theology, but in terms of the highest academic level of theology in Japan, it tends to be translation or interpretation of Western theology. And figures like Karl Barth, Paul Tillich, Wolfhard Pannenberg, etc. Okay, a little aside there. So one of my former colleagues at Tokyo Union, he had just retired a few years before I was a member of the faculty. His name was Kitamori Kazo sensei. He was very well known as the theologian of the pain of God in the post-war period. This is what he wrote in 1995 in his book, The Japanese Nihonjin to Seisho, The Japanese People and the Bible. Actually, in my own case, since I was born into a Buddhist family with absolutely no connection whatsoever with Christianity, I remember the first time seeing a church as a child and feeling immediately as I walked by, this must be the foreigner's residence. I remember thinking that the people who congregated in those churches were somehow different than the rest of us Japanese. I remember feeling offended because I knew that un-Japanese Japanese people were attending that church. This is not my idea, okay? This is a Japanese voice, okay? I think this is still the normative view of Christianity among the Japanese. Remember my student's mother coming to me, okay? Without a doubt, part of this reaction is a result of the guardedness Japanese have felt toward Christianity since it was declared an outlaw faith in the Edo era. But if we dig deeper, we find there is some sense in which being Christianized means losing one's Japaneseness and becoming non-Japanese. Okay, now, that's a complicated story. I don't want to veer off, which I can easily do, but I'll just say this. Because of the early and strong identification, especially after the Meiji era, of Japanese Christianity with modernity, Western modernity, Japanese churches have tended to reinforce this identification with the West. I already said that. Rather than seeking ways to, for example, develop cooperation with the neighboring churches in Korea, Taiwan, and China. And this, I taught at Tokyo Union Seminary for many years, and I would always say to my colleagues, do you have any friends in Korea? It's not a very nice question to ask, but what I was trying to say is, you know, isn't there some learning that could take place between these societies that are neighbors? Well, I'm not criticizing my colleagues. This is the tradition they received. And this is the tradition in which they stand. But I'm just trying to help you understand why Japanese Christianity is still somewhat an outlier, very much somewhat an outlier in the Japanese society. So, finally, I'll touch on this very devastating experience that I had personally. Okay, I was a professor of practical theology, and my PhD is in Christian education from Princeton Seminary, and I was teaching about how you pass on the faith to the next generation. And of course, if you're talking about passing on the faith to the next generation, you have to talk about the family, right? I mean, there's no other way to understand it. You know, even from the earliest days of Christianity, the family played a very significant role, and certainly in the Jewish traditions, the family was central to passing on the stories of the faith. And that's the case, I think, across Christian history as well. Okay, so that was my expertise. Well, this expert kind of got his feet cut out from underneath him, because I went to visit a church outside of Nagoya, and the church's pastor had invited me 1 year in advance of my lecture. Okay? The church had been praying and thinking about, why don't we have any young people in this church? Why are the children of the believers not even attending, not becoming baptized? Well, they may be baptized as children, but they will not be confirmed later on. Why? Why are the young people disappearing? So they thought this bird brain, PhD from Princeton had something interesting to share. So they called me down there, and I went down there, and I began with the Bible, of course. I spoke of the pivotal role of the family in passing on the faith, and then I talked about the history of catechesis in the early church, yada, yada, yada. I gave them my spiel, okay? It was basically a lecture that I give in the seminary for a more general audience, as I'm doing today. So after my lecture ended, a middle-aged man who was very brave stood up, and he was very troubled by my lecture, and this is what he told me. From the Meiji era until today, and the Meiji era began in 1858, and it went until 1912, I believe, around there. Anyway, from the Meiji era until today, most Japanese Christians had encountered some sort of discouragement in the midst of life. At that time, they happened to meet a pastor, and then under the teaching of that pastor, we heard the message of the Bible for the first time. In most cases, contrary to the will of our families, at some point we surrendered to Christ. In today's world, when I think, for example, of my 2 daughters who are living their lives happily, I doubt very much that they will experience the kind of personal setback that led me to Christ. Honestly, as a parent, I do not want him to go through that kind of painful setback. It's kind of an existential crisis that he went through. As an individual, I certainly am grateful that I surrendered to Christ and was led to the church, but I think my lecture, your lecture, Hastings' lecture, about the important role of the family in passing on the Christian faith is completely irrelevant given the realities of Japanese Christianity. Well, as you can imagine, I'm not sure if I was in tears or if I was just embarrassed on the train ride back to Tokyo, but honestly, it didn't reinforce my identity as a professor of practical theology. I pondered and prayed about those challenging words that he spoke to me. Of course, one story does not encapsulate the complete picture of Japanese churches. However, I think it clearly and honestly captures the problem that I have been developing. Christianity as a religion of individual decision. How that religion functions in exile within Japan, in exile outside of the religious ecology of the household, the local community, and the nation. Now, there are ways you can challenge that thesis, but think about that for a moment. Okay, I'm just going to end because I want to make sure we have plenty of time to discuss after a very quick run through the history. Japan has had a mixed relationship with the West and therefore a mixed relationship with Christianity. Okay, it began in Japan's Christian century. Mako he knows a lot about that, and this is the period when there were estimates of 400,000 Catholic converts. This is when Francis Xavier came to Kagoshima in 1549, and then Christianity was expelled as an outlawed faith approximately from 1630s until 1873. So from 1630 approximately to 1873, Christianity was actually illegal in Japan. And all around in the marketplaces of Japan, there were signs saying, "Death to the followers of Jesus." And there was a system instituted to make sure that you were not a hidden Christian, you were not hiding your faith. So every year, the father of the household would have to go to the local temple and trample on a cross or a picture of the Virgin Mary to reinsure the local authorities that they were not Christian. Now, you know, there's some debate historically about how thoroughly that fumie was promulgated across all parts of Japan, but in certain parts of Japan where there were a lot of Christians, like Nagasaki, this was a very, very effective way to stamp out Christianity. You're stamping out by making people stamp on what they consider to be sacred. Okay, all right. That's the. So imagine, and there were many martyrs. I don't want to forget to mention that. And it's very difficult to find out the numbers of people who were martyred, but it's from several hundred to several thousand. We don't know. We have records of several hundred, physical records. Another PhD grad, Haruko Nawata Ward, actually has done really good research on that. And in the 1850s, when the missionaries came back to Japan, all of a sudden some people who said they were still Christians appeared in Nagasaki, and it was a shock. They're called hidden Christians. So somehow for 250 plus years, they were able to maintain some aspect of Christian faith. Okay? It's a very complicated story. And then, well, just before the missionaries came back, why did the Japanese open their ports again? Because we had a great policy in the United States. We started this along the Barbary Coast, northern Africa area. We would basically show up with guns, big gunboats, and say, open your ports for trade. That was our American policy at the time. It's sort of like a 19th century version of current tariffs, you might say, forcing people into our economic sphere with military force. Now that's very interesting. Think about that. That's what happened. Admiral Perry showed up, and then later on more black ships came. And the Japanese people did not have big boats and big guns to defend themselves, so they capitulated. And they opened their ports to foreign trade. And the missionaries came back. Protestant and Catholic missionaries started arriving in the 1850s. So the first one was out with the missionaries, out with Christianity. The second one was, we're going to come whether you like it or not. That's not exactly the best process for making friends. You know, I don't think they read How to Make Friends and Influence People. Dale Carnegie never went to Japan, I guess. Okay, so, or America. So, you know, at any rate, don't get me off on that one. So, the third problem was, okay, the missionaries are there, and now there are many families and leaders of those families who are the sons of samurai, the elite of Japan, who converted to Protestantism and Catholicism, and they basically started leading the Japanese churches, which was a tiny, tiny minority. Okay. But the question must be asked, is this movement a genuine spiritual Christian revival, or was it a result of the pressure from the West? And nobody can guess another person's motivation. I can't even figure out my own most of the time. I don't know about you. But at this age, I gave up on that. Yeah. He's laughing because he knows. But here's what one first-generation Japanese Christian said. I was a thoroughgoing nationalist and did not become a Christian because of any deep conviction. I had not yet even the slightest taste of spiritual Christianity. And it was simply because Christianity was the religion of the so-called civilized nations, making Shinto and Buddhism useless. I was only convinced in my heart that without Christianity, Japan could never become civilized like the Western countries. Now that is Tamura Naomi. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on him. He was the first Japanese to graduate from Princeton Seminary, 1886. Okay? So what he's saying there, later on he understood a little bit more about the spiritual side of Christianity. But at the beginning, he felt like this would help his country. You understand that, right? You can see why. I mean, the West had strong military, strong economies, all of the things that made Japan very much a second-class citizen in the second half of the 1800s, okay, the 19th century. Okay, now, so there's internal backlash against Christianity that happens at this time too, which is very interesting and very important. So first of all, the Japanese, realizing that they're on the back foot, as the Brits say, they're in the weak position in regard to the Western colonial powers. They decided to go after Western technology, science, capitalism, and also they had to figure out how to unify Japan. Again, a very long story, which I will encapsulate in one sentence. Japan is a number of countries within Japan. People in Kagoshima don't understand, if they speak their local dialect, they don't understand people in Sendai if they speak their local dialect. They don't understand each other. So they had to, modern Japanese don't understand that this is the truth. Even in 1960s, 70s, when I first went to Japan, I ran into people, Japanese people who couldn't, if they spoke in their local dialects, they could not understand each other. So Japan is a very rich local art, local food, local geography, local everything kind of society. It's very rich. Local, local, local. So the Meiji government had this task of trying to unify this very diverse country. And the only way that they did it, or they could figure out how to do it, was to take the lead of the Germans and do it from top down with moral education. And they instituted a very strict regimen of moral education, including the imperial rescript on education, which every child in Japan, Japanese school, had to recite at various festival times. So there was a sense that Christianity is invading, it's a foreign faith. There's an expression in Japanese, batakusai, smells like butter. Batakusai. Yeah, that's right. I heard that a lot in Kanazawa, actually. Yeah, seriously, that was in the 1980s. Okay, so Christianity is now being attacked by the Japanese government. This happens in the 1890s. And the mission schools were hit very hard. Some of the mission schools refused to obey this rule, but they could not hold religious ceremonies or teach religious classes. Okay? Okay, so you understand this is internal and external. All right, I'm going to jump ahead because I want to end with a, okay, there was a time of testing that from 1933 to 1945, Japan was at war. The war didn't start with the West directly until 1941, but in 1933, Japan basically they had annexed part of China, and they created an incident which became known as the Manchurian incident. And China was a very poor country, and Japan basically colonized parts of China. This is before World War II, but they call it the 15-year war in China. Okay, they call it the 15-year war. Sorry, 12-year war. Okay, Now, this is hard for us to understand how strict the regime was during World War II. But let me just say this. The Christian cause met its next major test in the 1930s and 40s when the government mandated participation in the Shinto rite of imperial subjects. All Japanese subjects, both in Japan, in Korea, in Taiwan, and China, had to bow to the imperial shrine in Tokyo. It's called the Kokumin Gide. And the territories in the expanding empire were under this edict too. And the government strengthened its grip on religious groups with the 1939 passage of the Religious Organization Law, Shukyo Dantai Ho. And this Shukyo Dantai Ho, this religious organization law, put all Protestant denominations under one head, okay? Episcopalians and Presbyterians and Methodists, we were all together. They forced an ecumenical movement. Actually, there's an irony there that they actually forced an ecumenical movement because, you know, in America, you go to an Episcopal church, this is back in those days, Presbyterian church, etc. You don't talk about religion with, you know, in Japan, all of the Christians, all of the Protestants were brought under one umbrella. After the war, several left. The Episcopalians were about the first ones to leave because Presbyterians didn't recognize bishops. Sorry about that. Please forgive me. I'm actually a hybrid, Roman Catholic by birth, Presbyterian convert. The negative impact of World War II on Japanese Christianity calls we as Americans to reflect. And I'm going to give a brief reflection, and then I'm going to end and open it up for a discussion. Undoubtedly, suspicions about Christianity were even worsened by the 15-year war that began with Japan's expansionism and ended with America's dropping of 2 atomic bombs, resulting mostly in civilian deaths in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As American Christians, we need to reckon with the fact that with only a few notable suggestions, most of us have continued to follow our government's official party line, justifying the use of atomic bombs as a necessary evil to bringing an end to that long, brutal war. We've all heard that, right? It was terrible, but we had to do it. That's basically our government's official line. After living and working in Japan for more than 2 decades, I began to rethink the bombs, and remember, it's the bombs, and they were dropped 3 days apart from each other. That was what they had already decided. They were going to do both bombs, but 3 days apart. Even after we began to get reports from Hiroshima, they still went ahead and dropped the bomb on Nagasaki. So I would never have considered what I'm about to tell you if I did not live in Japan for so long. Now, I'm not saying, oh, the Japanese were great, or America was bad, or America was great, and the Japanese were bad. International relations are very nuanced and very, very intertwined. So, in my experience as a missionary, though most Japanese have, at least on the surface, been tolerant and even appreciative of the presence of American missionaries, I believe there is still a deep unspoken trauma from being the only nation in history, up until today, to experience firsthand the devastation of atomic weapons. I believe this enduring trauma cannot be unrelated to the snail's pace progress of Christian mission in Japan. That is because, with the exception of a very tiny minority of peace churches in America, the Mennonites and the Quakers, etc., the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki with the enthusiastic support of a nation where well over 90% of its citizens, this is in 1945, profess to be Protestant, Catholic, or Orthodox Christians. Given this fact, is it really any wonder that Japan's earlier reticence about Christianity was only hardened by America's refusal to apologize for our use of atomic bombs? And to this day, we have not officially apologized. So in closing, remember the words of Reverend Osumi, welcome to Rome in AD 150. Seen from both the perspective of human history and salvation history, perhaps the Japanese church's situation is not so desolate as we may be tempted to conclude. And again, if you look at the early church in the Roman and Greco world, it was not mega churches. It was tiny, small groups, as Pastor George knows. He studied that. This was a tiny movement, especially before Constantine and his son's edicts. In terms of Lamin Sane's description of the translation of the gospel as a process that embraces the movements of relativization and destigmatization. Relativization, you can't make an idol of the Western Christian understanding. That's what he means by relativization. Even though some missionaries talked as if they had the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, we should be honest about that. They were just as fallible as the rest of us. So it takes a long time to relativize that missionary hubris. And then the other part is the destigmatization. There are beautiful aspects of Japanese culture. This has been Mako's, life's work. There are beautiful aspects of Japanese culture which on a deep level reflect, I'll say it, the glory of God in Jesus Christ. Okay, so Japan has been engaged in this process since Francis Xavier arrived in Kagoshima in 1549. So, dependence on the conceptual worldview of the Western theological canon and other factors leaves many Japanese Christians feeling exiled from their own people or dressed up in ill-fitting clothing, as Shusaku Endo used to say. Nevertheless, we should not lose hope. This is the reality of the gospel. In his 1916 Silence and Beauty, Hidden Faith Born of Suffering, Mako characterizes modern Japan as a Christ-hidden culture. Kiristo ga kakusarete iru bunka. Christ-hidden culture. He argues that Japanese novelists and other artists, I would include him, have often been more eloquent than theologians. Sorry, I'm a theologian, so I'm criticizing myself. In addressing the depth dimension of Japan's ambivalent relationship to Christ and Christianity. Throughout a history of ambiguous interactions with Western Christianity, including a devastating war with the nations that sent the missionaries in the first place. Yeah. Japanese churches have remained focused on Christ's cross. More than the resurrection, Christ's cross. I often told my Japanese students that faith in Jesus Christ will make them feel more, not less Japanese. Was that just the wishful thinking of a naive American missionary? Maybe, but I don't think so. I'll be brash and say that. I don't think so. In this post-missionary, post-colonial global era of AI, as the world Christian movement continues to emerge in new fertile soils, I fully expect someday Japanese Christians who have often felt like exiles in their own land will be gifted by God with new ways to express their distinctive identity and experience of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And when this happens, we will all be challenged and encouraged as the light of Jesus Christ is refracted in new ways through the prism of Japan's beautiful Christ-hidden culture. Thank you. Q&A.
Thank you so much. And yeah, let's open it up. We have time for a few questions. Yes.
What a wonderful talk for somebody who doesn't really know anything about it at all. But I've been entertaining the idea, very sad idea, for quite a long time. I'm a student of the European Middle Ages, ex-professor. I think the paradigm that you give is the paradigm of the conversion of Europe and every other place in which Christianity is now strong. That is to say, it comes with guns, with a coercive civil government, very often explicitly an imperial government. And the myth of the kind of spontaneous conversion of large numbers of people who suddenly get the spiritual enlightenment is just that. It is a myth. And I do believe there is this tension, permanent, changes radically through history, but a tension between what I'll call the civil Christian religion and real, what Tolstoy calls true Christianity.
Yeah.
That's a kind of discouraging conclusion.
I totally agree, and I thank you, Professor, for those comments. I totally agree. I think we cannot escape this reality that our history has basically followed the history of other societies too. And I want to just add one caveat to that. This has happened with other religious groups too. This has happened with Islam, it's happened with Judaism, it's happened with Buddhism in Sri Lanka and in Thailand and Myanmar. It's happened in other religious groups too. So somehow the entanglement of imperialism, as you say, the empire with faith, tempts people to do things that are absolutely unthinkable were they to follow the tenets of the founders of their religions. In all cases. In all cases. So what do you do with that? Well, I'm a follower of Jesus, and all I can say is that he said, in this world you shall have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. Now that sounds like another, if it's interpreted the wrong way, it sounds like a pie in the sky, everything's going to be fine by and by perspective. But that's not my view at all. It's in the reality that we face. The God who comes to us by self-emptying is never distant from those who have ears to hear, eyes to see. So I would just say, yes, and it's happening in our country in spades as we speak right now. Absolutely. And I mean, I don't mind saying this, and you can disagree with me if you want, but I believe that the manipulation of large segments of the Christian world by the current regime is, from my point of view, not just unconscionable, but I can only conclude that we have not done a good job of theologically educating people. So I'm not going to blame the public schools. I'm a theological educator. We have not done a good job of theologically educating our fellow believers. Yeah. Well, Mennonites are the conscience of the Western Church. For those who don't know, Mennonites and Quakers were the first to suggest to the Continental Congress in 1787, meeting here in Princeton, that slavery should be completely abolished. And they had a long petition of several thousand names, but I'm afraid the members of the Continental Congress were oblivious. So that's just a historical example of what he's saying. So the bonds that are in the home, the way you treat somebody at the cashier, the cashier when you make an exchange, yeah. Maybe Christianity is simpler than we've made it.
Last question? Oh. So, Tom, because of your expertise, many of us have not lived in Japan as long as you have and thought about this. So, two very simple, not simple, but two statements maybe. One, how can we love our Japanese neighbors, whether here or there, as a church? Two, what can we as a church learn from our friends in Japan of what it means to be a Christ follower?
Yeah.
Another lecture, maybe?
Yeah, well, I would just, yeah, this is right. I'm not unaware of that. Yeah, one of the most hopeful signs that I saw as I was leaving, as we were coming back to the States in 2008, was my Korean students, several of them, were being called to pastor Japanese congregations. You know some of them, Pei Sensei, Tom knows some of these people. Some of my Korean students have been called. They've learned the language so well and the culture, they can now serve. Now, I'm not saying there's no cultural tension that remains, but the Japanese congregation was willing to invite a Korean woman or man, I would prefer a woman, thank you very much, to be the pastor of their church. I thought, ooh, it's time for me to go home. We don't need any of these white guys around here anymore. Seriously. So that's those who have been persecuted by the Japanese, Koreans, and grew up in a society where the Japanese were seen as, really kind of evil enemies. For them to be serving congregations, breaking bread, preaching the gospel, I thought, oh, hallelujah. I think God's at work. So those who have been hurt by their forgiveness and their love can change the world. And the Japanese have many things to teach the world church, thanks. And one of them, I think, is that life is suffering. This is a Buddhist idea too. Love is suffering. Yeah, that would be the Christian spin on a Buddhist idea. Good, I like that. Love is suffering. And to persevere for generations, as I see Tom stop calling here, I know his mother, I knew his father, I know his siblings, I know his children, to persevere in the midst of very difficult circumstances is a testament to the reality that the covenant God never cancels God's end of the covenant. Even if we ignore the covenant, God never cancels God's end of the covenant. That's Presbyterian Theology 101, but I actually believe it. I actually believe it. It's helped me a lot through some tough times. So those are the two things I'd say.